Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast and to the second instalment of a little series on motivation we're running at the moment. It's January at the time this is going out, so a time of year we could potentially all use a little boost to our get up and go. So today we're going to be picking through 5 of the biggest factors that science and psychology tells us influence our motivation to study, or to really do anything else for that matter, and figuring out some practical hacks and actionable tips that you can use right away to help you get started, stay consistent, and keep going even in those moments our motivation wavers. To help me do all this today, I'm joined by the wonderful Peps McCrea, a former and award-winning maths teacher who now turns his attention to supporting schools and teachers and their students through his role as Director of Education at StepLab, through his ultra-concise, high-impact teaching book series, and his incredibly popular Evidence Snacks email series. His work is really excellent. I was instantly won over by his blend of attention that he pays to the research and the evidence base for the topics he writes on, but then fusing that with an incredibly practical and easy to apply right now style of advice. He's also a super kind-hearted guy. In short, pretty much our dream guest, and I'm really excited to introduce him to you today. I think you'll really enjoy our conversation because it's absolutely packed full of actionable ideas you can take away and use right now. So without further ado, let's meet Peps and dive right in. I wondered if we could start with a definition. What is motivation?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a good place to start because it's often a bit of like a kind of dark art in many ways. Certainly in school context or in learning context, and it can easily be confused with like lots of similar concepts such as like inspiration or drive or whatever it is. And so pinning down motivation, I think, really is the key to understanding it better and then starting to be able to like influence a bit more, do something about it. And I've spent a long time looking at different definitions in the research. And I think the most helpful definition of motivation is, this might sound a bit complicated, but we'll unpack it, okay? It is our brain's system for allocating attention, okay? And so what do we mean by that? Well, at any given moment, there are lots and lots of different things that are competing for our attention. So, right now listening to this, you might have other notifications on your phone. You might be seeing something out the window that's distracting you. You might be thinking about lunch. There are, in life, there are constantly multiple things that are competing for our attention. And yet we can only really attend to one thing at once. Our brain can't multitask. That is a myth. And so our brain needs some kind of way of deciding which of all of these different opportunities to deploy my limited attention towards, which of these is the best thing to put it towards. And I think that that's the best way for us to think about motivation as this system which looks at different opportunities and decides where to place our limited attention.
So what does the science tell us about where motivation comes from?
Yeah. So, and yes, this is this is the next question we need to kind of understand is like how it works. So if we kind of like understand what it is, then we need to understand how it works if we're going to start to influence it. First, we're going to start to leverage it for our own, to serve our own needs. And so there's a kind of couple of things to call out. The first is that it's not really like a personality trait as such. So, talking about people in general being motivated or not, as in like, I'm a really motivated person or I'm a really like not very motivated person, just doesn't make much sense when you look at the research. It turns out that it's much less of a personality trait and much more just a kind of like a response to our previous experiences and the situation we find ourselves in. So, if we've for example, had like really good experiences with something in the past, then it's much more likely we're going to be motivated towards that thing. If we're surrounded by lots of people who are all doing something, then it's much more likely we're going to be motivated towards that thing. And we can be like highly motivated towards one thing and totally not motivated towards another thing all at the same time. So, my son is highly motivated to play Minecraft any time of the day, and yet trying to get him to put his socks on in the morning to go out of the door, his motivation levels are very different. And the same, of course, is true for yourself and everybody listening if you think about it. And then the second thing to call out is that this system that our brain uses for deciding where to place our very precious attention is a kind of highly unconscious one. Our brain doesn't consult us along the way. It doesn't like lift up the phone and say, "Hey, William, what do you think we should attend to next?" It just makes that decision on our behalf for us. And all of a sudden you find yourself, no longer listening to Peps and William on the podcast. You find yourself like looking out the window or thinking about lunch or, checking your WhatsApp messages. And you never really noticed that shift happening. This kind of makes sense when you think about it, really, because life in general is really busy. There are lots and lots of things that we could possibly attend to. And it's been like that for hundreds of thousands of years. And as a result, our brain has kind of evolved to be kind of like a machine that makes decisions very quickly about where to allocate our attention, rather than trying to think through every opportunity and calculate it in detail. It's developed what are called in the research heuristics, which is basically a name for like rules of thumb or shortcuts, what we might call them. So it basically has these shortcuts that it uses to make decisions about where to allocate our attention. A bit like earlier on when I said, if there are lots of people around us doing something, then we tend to do that thing as well. That's just an example of a mental shortcut that our brain uses without telling us to allocate our attention. These shortcuts have been developed in order to maximize our chances of survival and success. It's got a very instinctual, primal base to the whole mechanism. If we feel we're in a situation where our survival is at threat, then we'll be highly motivated. If we feel we are in a situation where there is a big opportunity to be had, socially, with potential mates, there's opportunity to like get food or other resources or even more power. These are all kind of very primal instincts. Then we will be highly motivated towards those things. And we can look in more detail at kind of what exactly those shortcuts are in a bit. But maybe the last thing to say on the overall kind of mechanics of the system is that the way our brain is set up is to maximize our chances of survival and success based on the way that we as humans have lived over the last, hundreds of thousands of years. And as a result, like motivational mechanics aren't optimally set up for helping us to like learn academic stuff. Okay. The kind of our motivation to eat is, way, way, way stronger than our motivation to learn about maths. Because, 1,000 years ago, that was a much more important thing for us to be motivated towards, right? If we didn't eat, we would have died. If we didn't do maths, well, nothing really happened as a result, okay? And so we kind of, one of the things that we have to contend with as people in our modern world is a kind of like a brain that is optimized for our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And yet we live in a kind of world where hunting and gathering is no longer one of the main challenges we face. We could just go to the shop whenever we want and buy loads of high-calorie, dense food for highly affordable amounts of money. And yet the things that are important in our modern society, namely like knowing stuff, it's hugely important. Our brain isn't quite as like naturally motivated towards that stuff. And so we kind of have to, if we want to be more motivated towards that stuff, we kind of have to hack our brain a little bit.
So let's talk about how to do that. You talk about 5 core drivers. and maybe share a couple of practical suggestions that listeners can take away from this to help boost their motivation under each of those 5 core drivers. So the first one is secure success. So just briefly, what do we mean by secure success? What is that one all about?
Securing success, our brain uses these shortcuts to make decisions about where to kind of allocate our attention, which is basically motivation. And one of the first shortcuts or rules of thumb that it uses is this idea of our prior success rate. So if we have, felt success time after time after time with learning a particular subject or with a particular teacher or even a topic, then we're going to be much more likely to invest our attention and effort in that thing when we have the opportunity again in the future. By contrast, if we've experienced what we feel is failure kind of repeatedly, then it makes sense that we're just like not going to be all that motivated to, the next time we have the opportunity to engage with that thing. And so the first thing that we can do to boost our motivation is kind of to try and do whatever we can to increase our feeling of success. There are kind of a few things we can do there. We can break stuff down into smaller chunks. Is a really kind of easy strategy. Okay, because when we break things down into small pieces, they just become easier to complete. And we, a big part of our feeling of success comes through completing stuff. And so if we break things down in small bits and we complete, we have lots of kind of ticks, checklists, tick, 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 I've done all of this stuff, then it's going to make us feel more motivated. Now, one of the other important things is, well, of course, that we use effective study strategies. If we're, not using retrieval in some form, whether that's flashcards or self-quizzing, then we're really not going to end up feeling successful because we're not actually making lots of progress in our own understanding and remembering. And so, yes, I suppose as well as breaking things down, deploying really effective study strategies are highly effective. But the final thing just to call out is that feelings of success and failure are kind of a highly subjective thing as well. We might end up doing some self-study practice at home and we might find ourselves making some mistakes, but learning from those mistakes, we might not end up getting all of the questions done in the time we set aside. We might have to go and ask somebody for help with some questions. And in some ways, some people might think that that's been an incredibly successful study period because they've learnt loads and they've made loads of progress. Other people might think that that's been an incredibly unsuccessful study period because they didn't get all the questions right first time and had to ask for help. And so how we think about success can make a difference to whether we chalk it off as success or not. And so we also have to tell ourselves this story of what success means. And so it's important to kind of get that aligned with what true success means. So, true success is not about getting all of the questions done first time, on beating other people. True success in learning is really about making more progress than you did previously. It's kind of beating yourself. And if you make mistakes, and as long as you kind of bounce back from them, and if you ask for help, and you take your time, then you're winning. And you should define that as your kind of vision of success and be happy if some of that stuff happens, basically.
Yeah, I think that last one's really interesting. One of the things I sometimes talk about is process goals over outcome goals. So sometimes, particularly, take the example of you're trying to get your head around some quite challenging new material. Maths is a good example. You might not always be able to start answering questions and work through the questions you're supposed to be answering even on the first sitting, particularly once you get quite advanced levels. And sometimes you just need to sit and grapple with it and be stuck with it for a bit and kind of figure out those worked examples and try and really kind of understand what's going on. And just setting yourself that goal of time rather than outcome. Okay, I'm just going to sit with this for 20 minutes and just, even if I feel hopelessly stuck for 20 minutes, I'm going to sit and wrestle with it and be stuck with it for 20 minutes. And only then can you kind of work through that and come out the other side.
Yeah, 100%. I'd say time is really, setting time aside, but also making sure you start on get started. So it's I'm going to set aside this time and I'm going to get started straight away. And that, if you do that regularly, good things are going to happen.
Exactly. fully agree, of course, about like the importance of using good study strategy. I think, often when I talk to students that aren't feeling very motivated to revise, they're not using particularly effective strategies. And so, of course, no wonder you're not feeling very motivated, because whenever you sit down, you're not making progress. And there's nothing more demoralizing than sitting down and feel like you're not making any progress. So what's the point in even trying? So one of the most helpful motivational things I can teach is how to study more effectively, so that you do also feel more motivated. It has that sort of halo effect. And then, as you were saying, breaking it down. So yeah, you kind of gave the example of breaking down things into those smaller bits, so you can kind of tick them off. We have GCSE bite size here in the UK. Like, that got its name, I think, from that kind of principle. Just taking things one little bite at a time. And then, I guess at an even more granular level, when you're trying to do your retrieval practice, testing yourself, using your flashcards, perhaps, just making each one of those flashcards a bite-sized little nugget of information. So breaking up the information as far as you can over lots of smaller flashcards, each of which feels quite comfortable and doable, and you have a decent chance of success on it, rather than a smaller number of flashcards with essays written on the back, where it's very daunting to try and recall all that information in one go accurately. Great. Okay, so we secured success. The second on the list was run routines. So what do we mean by run routines, and why does that matter?
Right. Okay, so when our brain is trying to figure out where do we allocate our attention, where do we put in effort, as well as considering our prior success rate, what's the return on investment here, it also considers the amount of effort that we're going to have to put in. And if it feels like it's going to be a real effortful slog, and we're going to have to put in massive amounts of concentration and energy, then our brain tends to be a little bit less up for that. Our brain is lazy. Well, it's not, maybe lazy is not the right word. A kinder word is that it's highly resourceful. Okay. It doesn't like wasting its energy. It likes putting in effort where it sees that there's a clear kind of return. And so in research, one of the common findings is that you can kind of increase people's motivation by kind of making things easier. We kind of might be able to use that finding in some areas of our learning, but it doesn't really work that well, or it doesn't really translate all that well, because if we just make the kind of our content, the stuff we're trying to learn, easier, then we don't learn as much, and we don't make as much progress, and we kind of scupper our own, very goals. And so how do we square this circle? Well, routines and habits, which are kind of the same thing really, give us an answer to this, because when we have a habit in place, or a routine, and a habit and routine is basically just like a sequence of actions, like things that we do that are kind of triggered by a cue or a prompt. Yeah, just a thing that we do to start off with. For example, when your alarm clock goes off in the morning, and you jump out of bed, you go, you brush your teeth, you have breakfast, you have a shower, you get dressed, you head off to school or work or whatever it is. Like, that is an example of a habit or a routine. And your kind of brain makes all of those decisions for you without really having to think very much about them. When the alarm clock goes off, all the dominoes just basically fall in the right direction. And as a result, your brain doesn't really, it's actually an easier process for your brain. And as a result, it's reasonably motivating. Of course, getting up in the morning is never that motivating, but it's definitely easier when you have a set routine and an alarm clock, rather than having to figure it all out every time afresh for yourself. And the same is true when it comes to learning. If we have kind of set habits or set routines in place, then we don't have to think as much about the process of our learning itself. What am I going to do first? What am I going to do next? How's this going to work? How am I going to respond? All of that stuff kind of takes up effort in our brain. And so if we kind of have made all of that into a habit or a routine, we don't have to think about it. And as a result, we can put more of our very precious attention into thinking about the actual stuff we're trying to learn. And so routines basically allow us to reallocate or redeploy our very precious attention more towards the what of our learning, and less away from less towards the how of our learning. And as a result, it kind of increases our levels of motivation overall.
I'm a big fan of routines, a huge fan of that. It's been very supportive in my own life, both as a scholar, student, and since. And it's something I highly recommend as well. One other little idea that I think fits into this theme is leaving your stuff out the night before or in advance of a study session. So just that act of, getting out the book you want to work from, a stack of blank flashcards and a pen, and just laying it all out, open at the page for the chapter you're going to work on, or, getting that past paper printed off, put on the desk with a pen and the calculator next to it. So there is no friction at all to getting started. I guess that almost acts as a cue in a way, that kind of first cue in some ways when you sit down and it's just absolutely obvious what you're supposed to be doing.
The other thing that it does is it basically makes a first deposit, if that makes sense, or a first investment. And our brain really doesn't like what's kind of known as sunk cost. Our brain really doesn't like investing in things and then not finishing our investment. And so by getting stuff set up the night before and getting stuff laid out, you've kind of already placed your first chips, as it were, or made your first part of your investment. And so, your brain's much more reluctant then to not complete it. And so that's a really nice hack as well.
So sometimes these little things just sound so small, but actually they can be so powerful sometimes. The next one on the list is nudge norms. So, tell us about this one. So getting into a more sort of social dimension, I think, with this one, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. We're highly social creatures, whether we think it or not. And we are, significantly influenced by the people around us. The kind of name for this phenomenon is social norms, okay? When our brain is trying to do this job of figuring out where to allocate our attention, which is a really hard thing to do, by the way. It's life is super complex. And so deciding what's the best thing for me to attend to that's going to maximize my chances of survival and success, super, super hard thing for a brain to do. And as a result, it takes a very big shortcut. And it basically says, if everyone else around me is doing this thing or thinking this thing, I'm going to do and think that thing too, because that's a super safe bet. The idea of if everyone else around me is doing this thing and, I'm going to do something different, that's a really high risk strategy for us to take. And particularly, if we wind the clock back 100,000 years, if everyone else in our kind of tribe was, doing a certain thing and we just decided to go off and do our own thing, then, there's a high chance we kind of would have got left behind. We would have ended up with no food, getting eaten by a tiger, whatever it is. Following the kind of group norm is both a good bet and a kind of way of reducing our risk as a human, or at least it was in the past. But regardless, we still have those mechanics in our brain, and so we kind of have to work with them. The last thing to say is social norms are super, super powerful, way more powerful than kind of formal laws or rules or policies, things like that. For example, a school might have, its kind of behavior policy or learning policy, but actually, if all of the kind of children in that school behave in a certain way and have a certain attitude to learning, if they don't think learning is cool, then that's going to have a much greater effect on everyone learning than the kind of formal school rules and policies. And the kind of last thing I can maybe say to just give you a sense of just how powerful social norms are, if you imagine yourself at the cinema and then, if I come over to you and suggest that you stand up and start singing in the cinema whilst everyone else is watching, can you feel that kind of reaction almost in your gut as to you're being asked to do that? No way, man. No way. That would be the worst. That's what it feels like. Yeah, that's what it feels like to break social norms. So this is unconscious mechanics of our brain at work. There's an emotional response which kind of gets us to adopt the group norms and to really not break from them. And so how can we harness all of this social mechanics to our advantage? Well, earlier on when I talked about my son not wanting to put his socks on to leave the house, fine, but when he goes to school, his teacher can get him and 29 other kids to basically do stuff that's way more complex for hours and hours and hours on end. And the reason that his teacher can do that is because there are 29 other kids doing the same stuff. And so, if I wanted to increase my son's motivation to put his socks on in the morning, all I have to do is to get like 29 other kids around in the morning doing the same thing. Okay. All right. Now, what is Peps talking about here? Well, what point am I trying to make? Well, basically, if we want to try and increase our motivation for studying, for example, the more that we can surround ourselves with other people who are studying, the more motivated we will feel to do it. It's as simple as that. And so not only like the act of studying, but the attitude as well. So if we can surround ourselves not only by people who are doing lots of studying, but love it, who are really into it and believe it's hugely important, then all of that will basically influence our own actions and beliefs in a really positive way. And so how can we do that? Well, you might have an opportunity to have like a study club after school. If you don't and you're at home, then there are things like study tubing, the phenomenon of study tubing, which I'm sure you've come across, whereby you can just go on YouTube and hang out with potentially thousands of other people who are studying, all quietly, all silently. But you might think that's a bit crazy, but the social norm effect is really powerful, even in that kind of like online context. And so it can, if you haven't tried it before, definitely try it. It's super, super powerful. You will end up being much, much more motivated just because there's like a whole bunch of other people somewhere else in the world doing something similar at that time.
Yeah. So there's one girl I was talking to recently who just turns the camera on her, and she doesn't have any followers. There's no one watching her or anything, but she just broadcasts live to empty space. and just knowing that, like, in theory, she might be being watched. The people might be out there seeing her. Yeah. Like that for her is just the key to, staying focused and staying on task. Yeah, for me, like, location is such a big one. Where you go, surrounding yourself with other people, that can be, again, such a powerful thing. If you don't have access to somewhere at school, like, is there a library in town? Or, for some people, even a coffee shop works quite well. For me, that's a little bit too distracting. I want somewhere a bit quieter. But yeah, to experimenting and seeing what spaces are around you where you live can be a really big one.
And if you can't be with people in the moment, then even just checking in with people afterwards. So having like a WhatsApp group or Snapchat group where you're like, oh, we're revising today. And then everyone commits to just basically saying, like, I revised for 20 minutes this morning. I did this. Like, just checking in with everyone. It's not quite as powerful, but it gets you a good part of the way there.
Yeah. Yeah. So having sort of those accountability partners.
Yeah.
So in at number 4, build belonging. Tell us a little bit about what this one is all about.
Right. So belonging is actually very closely related to the social norms thing, because the effect of other people on our own actions and attitudes is highly dependent on how much we feel we identify with them, right? So all that stuff we've just talked about, being in a library with lots of other people who are all studying. Actually, if we don't feel like those people are our crew, if they're like totally people we don't relate to, then actually the social norms that they're exhibiting won't really have that much an influence on us. And actually, we might even like kind of deep down reject them, or, try and at least, kind of not go along with them. And so for social norms to have the strongest effect, we kind of need to feel like we belong to that group of people. And so how can we kind of like hack this one a little bit? Well, we can, make sure we're hanging out with people we identify with, like, but we might not always have that option. And so how can we kind of increase our sense of belonging to some people? Well, a good way that we can do this is basically by like finding out what we have in common. So kind of lots of research suggests that whenever we find out that we have stuff in common with people, we feel like we, identify with them a little bit more. We belong in the same kind of group a bit more. So, William, if we found out that we had the same birthday and we like the same pizza topping, then, we'd feel like, belong a little bit more in the kind of group. And as a result, the social norms that we exhibit would have a greater influence on each other. And so kind of taking the time to, find out about those people who you're hanging out with, who you're studying with, will increase your sense of belonging, and as a result, increase that social norm effect that's in place. And last thing to kind of say on belonging is that, as well as increasing your motivation, it also is really good for your kind of well-being as well. So, not feeling like you belong has pretty bad consequences for your well-being, and it gets pretty dark. Whereas when you feel like you belong to a group, you identify to a group, not only does it help you learn more, but you feel really good as a result. It doesn't always need to just be people who you can have within reach, your local physical group. Like you can have idols, people you like identify with, who you follow online, who have good attitudes or have attitudes that you want to kind of align with around studying and education and life. And even by following those people, even though they don't know you, that kind of like, if they're an idol for your group of people, then that will in some ways increase your kind of like sense of belonging and have an effect on the kind of norms that you want.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And one of the things that I've heard draws people to this very show is, otherwise some people, not true for everybody, but some people otherwise feel like they're a little bit isolated. Maybe they're, maybe they're an adult and they're kind of on their own doing some studying, or, maybe you're still in sort of formal education, you're at school or university, but for whatever reason, you don't feel like you associate with your peers quite so much academically. Yeah. Maybe your standards just are quite a bit higher than those around you, and you don't feel like academically, at least, you kind of relate to them quite so much. And one of my hopes in creating this show is, this creates a sort of a community where people feel like they can belong in terms of their kind of academic ideals, and have role models to look to, whether it's our experts like yourself, Peps, or whether it's, perhaps peers like the student stories we feature on the show from time to time, Charlie and Rose and kind of all the other students over the years that we've featured that you can kind of relate to perhaps a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're doing a good job of that as well, William.
Oh, that's too kind of you. Okay, so our final one is boost buy-in. So talk us through this one, Peps.
Sure. So the kind of final thing that we can do to kind of hack our motivation is to remind ourselves of the choice that we are making, really. Our brain absolutely loves the feeling of a choice or autonomy, okay? It finds it really motivating when it thinks that, this is something that I'm choosing to do. And so if we can somehow, or whatever we can do to make studying a thing that we are choosing to do, rather than a thing that we feel like we are being forced or compelled to do, if we can kind of make that mind shift, then it will have a really big impact on our motivation. And so, how can we do this? Well, it's kind of, reasonably simple. All we kind of have to do is keep reminding ourselves why we're doing this stuff, like explaining that to ourselves. And, whether that is when you sit down to study, just like sitting down and remind yourself, like, what's this going to help me achieve in my life? Like, why am I choosing to do this? And even using that language, like, why am I choosing to spend my time doing this stuff now? Like, what do I hope I'm getting for this? How will my life be better as a result? Or, whether that's before you sit down to like a big period of like 3 or 4 months of study, like getting really, really clear, listing out all of the benefits that this is going to bring potentially to your life if you do a good job of it. And then the kind of final thing is we can, what I call like implementation intentions in the literature. The more specific we can be about what, not only why we're doing it, but what we're going to do, the more likely that we're going to end up doing it. So as well as kind of sitting down and saying, right, this is why this is really important to me, and this is why I'm choosing to do this stuff, it can also be helpful to say, this is exactly what I'm going to do. And even though in your head you kind of have a sense of that, actually like writing it down, being really precise, I'm going to sit there, I'm going to open this book, I'm going to write this down for this amount of time, and when I come across like a question, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. All of that like increases your chances that it gets done. And if you want to like supercharge that even further, you can kind of declare all of this publicly, a bit like the example you said earlier about, somebody like pointing the webcam at themselves. If you do that and at the start you say publicly, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, and this is exactly what I plan to do, then you vastly increase the chances that all of this stuff happens. So this is like, fairly sophisticated way to hack your own motivation, but fun to experiment with, even though it might feel a little bit uncomfortable when you do it to begin with. Like, definitely worth playing around with.
Definitely. Episode 99, Why Study the Power of Purpose, is an 18-minute exploration of the power of considering your why and all the different whys. I collected a few ideas from listeners about all the different things that are kind of their reasons for why they study. And there's some really powerful ones that I'd never have thought of on my own that came through.
Nice.
And then for the kind of public declaration, one little trick that can be quite a nice one that's quite popular with some people is the calendar chain method posted publicly. So the calendar chain is list of dates, ticking off each one as you go if you achieve what you set out to do on that date. So for example, your goal is, I want to get in an hour of revision per day, or 10 minutes or 4 hours, or whatever your goal is. Each day you achieve that goal, you give it a tick next to that date, or, gold stars. I do this as well, and I've got a drawer full of gold and silver stars, and I give myself a gold sticker. What's better than getting a gold sticker at the end of the day? And then a further twist on this is putting that chart somewhere public, so somewhere downstairs, maybe in the kitchen where your family will see it, or kind of in a place in the dorm where your roommates will see it. And that just acts as a kind of a subtle little, you want to show off that you've ticked off that date to everyone else, and get that kind of social support. And equally, you don't want the kind of embarrassment of a small little embarrassment of having missed a day, ideally. So it acts as kind of just a little bit of subtle social pressure, linking perhaps back into a couple of the previous ones we were talking about social norms and belonging as well. I think that sort of links into those themes as well.
I love that. I'm actually making a note to myself to create my own star chart.
Well, there you go. Maybe you need one in your kitchen for putting your socks on in under 5 minutes in the morning. Excellent. Well, Peps, thank you so much once again for being so generous in sharing your wisdom and expertise and all the interesting science behind this, as well as the practical takeaways. Absolutely, absolutely love it. Thank you so much. If anyone listening wants to find out a little bit more about your world and the things you write about and teach about and email about, where should we go?
Well, you can. There's not many people called Peps in the world, so you don't have to go far to find me. So yeah, if you just get on Google and just search for Peps, it will it'll take you there. I've written a few books on this stuff. They're probably the most useful and accessible way to kind of jump into this stuff. Yeah, Motivated Teaching is the kind of name of the book that we've talked about today. But I also write a weekly 5-minute newsletter that basically talks about effective teaching. Which, obviously covers lots of aspects of learning. And so, if you want to kind of keep up with the evidence in just 5 minutes a week, then check that out. That's called Evidence Snacks. And it does what it says on the tin.
It's a great email. It's one of the emails I look forward to receiving in my inbox every week. It's always an interesting read. Peps, thank you once again, and we'll talk soon.
Sweet. Cheers, guys. Have a good week.
Well, thanks again, Peps. And do look out for Peps's Perfect Patter popping back on the podcast a little later in the year, when he's going to be applying his same style to helping us understand some of the fundamental principles of memory. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you're feeling some fresh motivation to study following this episode today. And I just wanted to wish you every success, as always, in your studies.
Wasn't that wonderful? If you're feeling inspired, why not leave us a rating and a review in your podcast app? It would make our day. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.